Corn School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Headline Amp Fungicide and Pride Seeds.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to the Corn School. It's our first episode of 2022, and we're going to kick things off by looking back at the tremendous yields witnessed in Ontario in 2021. It appears the average yield for the year will be just over 200 bushels per acre, a new record. Where's all this yield coming from? No doubt, good growing conditions play a key role, but today we're going to take a closer look at kernel weight. A component that's been attracting a lot of attention in recent years. And for some thoughts on how kernel weights are impacting yield, today I'm joined by Purdue University agronomy professor Dr. Tony Vine. Hi, Tony. Welcome to Corn School.
Thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Now, Tony, when we discuss the components of yield, we typically talk about three things: the number of corn ears, kernel numbers, and kernel weight. A lot of the discussion in Ontario during harvest 2021 was the size and weight of the corn kernels. Question for you: how much does kernel weight contribute to corn yield, and is it becoming more important?
Yes, the recent evidence from some studies that we've conducted based on hybrids over the last 40 years, particularly, suggests that the more and more of the yield is coming from kernel weight, more so than kernel number. And that ratio, of course, it's going to vary with how are you comparing those hybrids, what plant density are you using, what growing conditions are you using, what nitrogen fertilizer are you using. But to round things up, the most recent evidence is that about 2/3 of the yield increase in the last 30 years is coming from higher kernel weights, and about 1/3 of the yield increase is coming from higher kernel number when the comparisons are made for hybrids at their optimum plant density.
Now, Tony, can you walk us through the growth stages and explain how those kernels are filling and contributing to those higher grain yields?
A key component of kernel weight, first of all, is that all of the action is in the reproductive period, in contrast to kernel number, where that determination begins to be made earlier in vegetative growth. So kernel weight is by and large a story that begins with pollination, and it is particularly active in the first 2 weeks after pollination in what we call the lag period. And it is during this period that there's a fair bit of sugars and nitrogen and other things in these very, very tiny, watery blisters, you might say, that we call kernels at that time, or potential kernels. But the action during that lag period is all about cell division, especially in the endosperm, which is the biggest part of the corn kernel. And it is in that cell division process that we set the stage for how big or what the potential size of that kernel actually is going to get to be. And so if you have a lot of fortuitous conditions, lots of great cell division going on, you set the stage for a large potential kernel weight. That lag period is about 14 to 17 days, depending on the environment. And during that time, it's surprisingly little dry matter gain that actually occurs. And it's not until we get to the end of the lag period that all of a sudden we go into this steep linear period. And during that steep linear period, we in effect fill that potential that was defined in a way during the lag period. And that filling that occurs in that linear period is a function of many factors that we can get into, But there's two primary control mechanisms. The one is how steep is that increase that's actually occurring, and basically that's, in other words, rate. How much weight are you adding per day or per temperature unit during that grain filling period? And that's a function of hybrid. It's a function of management. And then the second factor is, what is the length of that linear period? And so there's two ways of really increasing that kernel weight. And the one is to have the kind of hybrid and management situation that gives you a steep rate of kernel dry matter gain during that linear period. And the second is to try to extend the linear period itself. And so if you can add another 3 or 4 days to that linear period, you can end up with higher kernel weights at the end.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tony, I want to talk about the management factors that control that, that weight increase and things that growers can, control. You mentioned in your presentation at the Ontario Agriculture Conference that, setting potential for high kernel weights starts with nitrogen, and obviously you've got to protect and keep that plant healthy.
Well, yes, we first of all you need water and sunlight, and plenty of it during that second half of the critical period that we call the lag period, right after flowering. I mean, the period just before flowering is also important. But let's assume that we have an ideal situation with lots of sunlight and adequate water for the highest possible rates of photosynthesis and transpiration to occur during that lag period. During the rest of the during that lag period, it is essential that we have high nitrogen availability, and it is also essential that we have good balance of that nitrogen with other nutrients, including sulfur and phosphorus and even micronutrients like zinc. But the key element in this, in part because of its dominance as a mineral element at that time, is nitrogen. And we've sometimes been able to measure in these young ears where pollination has just occurred that you might have 4, 5, 6% nitrogen in that young reproductive tissue. And so the dominant nutrient is nitrogen, but we can't overlook these others, and particularly we can't overlook the balance of nitrogen to make sure that there is no other macro or micronutrient that is limiting the response, especially the cell division response during that lag period.
Now, have you had, is there any evidence, Tony, of that optimum rate of nitrogen, or is that dependent again on conditions and obviously the potential of the soil and everything that you're dealing with in your growing area?
That's a very difficult question to answer in one general fashion. And so I'm not going to go there with a specific rate, except to say that it is that there are some clues that you can pick up. Okay, and part of the clues that you can pick up as to whether your nitrogen is sufficient or not is to be looking at leaf tissue nutrient concentrations right before that period. And it's been our experience that we tend to get the best possible potential kernel weights when our leaf nitrogen concentrations going into that period are above 3% nitrogen. And so those can be measured in the ear leaf, but I'm also interested at the beginning of flowering. But in order to perhaps consider a management shift, we need to be focused on tissue testing at, let's say, the V12 stage, some period before that flowering period even begins in order to look at leaf tissue sufficiency. And so it's not so much, there's a magic rate or there is even a magic timing or a magic number of splits. It is more for that plant density, for that hybrid, for that environment. Are you achieving the tissue nutrient concentrations in the leaves during that period that are going to make sure that the ear itself and these young developing kernels aren't short of nitrogen?
Mm. Now, you and Dr. Dave Hooker presented on this topic at the Ontario Agricultural Conference, and Dave noted that you can't forget about the importance of good agronomy, crop rotation, soil health, and the need for kernel numbers. We have got to have lots of kernels to have heavy kernels. But what about hybrid selection? Tony, you talked about having a hybrid that is able to flex and take advantage of those good growing conditions that you talked about and make those heavy kernels. What should we be asking our seed suppliers about a hybrid when in this context?
Well, it's hybrid selection is extremely important, but every hybrid flexes. Okay, so there's no such thing as a hybrid that doesn't flex in kernel number when you, for instance, reduce the plant density or when you improve, let's say, rainfall and nutrient management. Every hybrid flexes to some extent when it comes to kernel weight. But what we find is that there are differences in the range of that flexibility. And in a year, in an optimum year like you had in 2021, it would be really helpful to know which hybrids flex the most in terms of kernel weight to take advantage of the optimum moisture situation with the regular rains that many growers in Ontario experience. Not everyone experienced that. In Indiana, we had just fabulous kernel numbers based on going up to 600 kernels plus per plant, even at populations of, let's say, 32,000 per acre. And then we ran into a dry period and we didn't achieve the kernel weights that I was hoping to, and so that constrained us a little bit. But it's trying to learn more from the seed supplier about the opportunity for that hybrid to respond to achieve increased kernel depth, or length, you might say, under optimum conditions. And if that hybrids vary in the extent to which they flex. You also, of course, want to have a hybrid that is quite good at avoiding kernel abortion, right? Because you really need the two together, right? And so you need both the high kernel number, but once you've got the high kernel number and you've gone through the end of the lag period and you've kept those kernels from aborting, especially the tip kernels, then it's really helpful under optimum conditions to have a hybrid that flexes more in its depth, and so you get wider girth, you might say, of the ears.
Tony, hey, some great insights. I really want to thank you for joining us on Corn School, and hopefully next time we'll get to do it in person.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Bernard, for the opportunity today, and best wishes for 2022.
Thank you, sir.